Welcome back to the Cozy Cottage Homestead. Sorry if you hear a little noise in the background. My neighbor is out on his tractor. So today we're going to be canning tomatoes. And the tomatoes are still going strong. I've already picked enough to can what I think is going to be about 7 pints. So join me in the kitchen and let's get to canning some tomatoes. Welcome back to the Cozy Cottage Homestead. Today I'm going to do a really short video on a really easy process to can all those homegrown tomatoes. I was actually hesitant to do this video because it's really quite simple, even for beginners, but hey, you never know. There may be beginners that's just learning how to can tomatoes. For me personally, it's extremely important, makes the process a lot easier if everything is ready, everything is prepared. It's simple, but there's a lot of steps. You know, you get some water baths, get your water going, have your tomatoes ready, have your lids and your jars all clean. We use to heat them in the oven method to sanitize them. I still use the little pot of water to boil the lids. So everything is setting out. With the tomatoes, you have to peel them first. You add hot water to it after you peel them and put them in the jars. And I'm going to go through the steps, and I'm going to step out of the way of the camera and then just switch it over to showing you the steps. But in case you don't watch the whole video, the ball canning book says to add a half a teaspoon of salt. And I use plain salt, not canning salt. It's very similar, very close to the same thing. Just don't use the iodized salt because it will ruin your tomatoes and can possibly cause it to change colors and react with the metal bands and lids. So use plain salt if you have it, or canning salt. So that's a half a teaspoon per pint. So the other thing is you have to put the tomatoes in the jar, get all the bubbles out of it, use water that is in a kettle. So I always have 2 things of water going, even though this is going to be a small batch. I'm only doing 7 pints. I'm going to try to can as my stuff comes in instead of waiting to do larger batches. It seems that is the easier thing for me to do right now, is to, instead of chancing something spoiling, to go ahead and can it every time I get enough. Last week I've done pickles. Of course, I didn't make a video on it, but I mentioned it in another video. It may be out already by the time you see this, and it may not, I'm not sure. But I do have both kettles full of water, and what I do is bring both of them to a rolling boil and then cut them off. And then I'll stop that. I'll work on my tomatoes, peel them. And I'll show you those steps in just a second. So without anything else that I could think of, I do have my ball canning book here as a reference. It shows you how to can the tomatoes. My book is old, so I know all the newer books probably have different processes, different methods, but I'm pretty sure the tomatoes is pretty much the same with how to can them and process them. And I do it the old school way. I don't use an Instapot canner or nothing like that. I literally have an old-fashioned canner, set it on top of the stove, and with the tomatoes, they are water bath because they are high acidic, and you don't have to pressure can them. Which generally, I believe pickles was the first thing that I learned to can, but tomatoes was right behind, and then maybe green beans. And I think it was because it was a water bath method. So lots of beginners are comfortable with the water bath method, and I agree. I was for years quite intimidated with the pressure canner, but it's not a problem no more. So I'll bring y'all back in just a second and show you what I do step for step. Getting ready to can the tomatoes, the first step is to collect all your ripe tomatoes. You don't want overripe or underripe. Underripe's better than overripe. But the first thing you want to do is give them a good bath and wash them. And then we're going to put them into a pot that is boiling. And we're going to leave them in there for just a couple of minutes so that the peels slip right off. And I'll show you the next step when I get that started. Alright, so we have our tomatoes in our boiling hot water. we're going to let it come to a boil, and then usually it doesn't take long and you'll see that the peels change just a little bit, and then we'll be able to peel them. We already have our lids back there, and we have our pot ready to go. Sorry about that, we have a little fog from the steam, and I'll show you what we do next. So the next step would be to take the tomatoes out of the boiling water. I usually wait till I see one little crack or so and see if I can find one to show you what I'm talking about. It's where the peel starts to come, it cracks a little bit, and then I know they've been in the boiling water long enough. So I put them in ice water. I usually have frozen blocks of ice that I keep, like an ancient old ice cream container that's plastic, and I keep it for ice block, and they come in handy when you're doing canning tomatoes. When it gets really cold and you put the tomatoes in the water, it makes them peel easier. So then of course you just want to peel them and cut the core end out of the tomatoes, and I can my tomatoes whole and stuff them in the jars just like that whole. And I will bring y'all back and show you the next step on how we put them into jars and start the canning. Yay, we have all the tomatoes peeled. Now what to do with the peelings? You could do whatever you would like to do with them. I like to feed them to my chickens, but you could also put them in a food processor and then turn them into a powder. You also could just put them in a food processor and put them in a freezer bag, add to soups and stews, spaghetti, stuff like that. It's very delicious and nutritious for my chickens, and they enjoy getting what we call table scraps, especially from canning tomatoes. So now we're going to put these into our pint-sized jars, and I'll bring you back and show you what that looks like. I'm not going to bore you with stuffing it into the jars, but I'll show you what the finished product looks like before we stick them in the canner. Alright, we have made it to the almost final stage. All 7 jars we guessed just about right. It made the 7 pints. We've already put a half a teaspoon of salt in each one. And what we did was, with the tomato juice that was in the bowl with the tomatoes that were peeled, is we topped off the jars with them. And you want to leave a 1/2 inch headspace. And now my husband is just simply wiping off the rims. The tomatoes have already been debubbled and checked for the proper liquid height in each jar. And then we will simply stick them in the water bath canner. Now I can them whole, and I do that for a specific reason, because when you cook with homegrown canned tomatoes, they tend to just kind of fall apart into whatever you're cooking. So I kind of skip that step and don't waste my time chopping tomatoes or putting it through a food processor. And also, I can always pull out a jar of homegrown canned tomatoes and then put them in a food processor and make homemade salsa within just minutes. So I do canned salsa if I get a bunch of tomatoes and I have all the canned tomatoes that I want, and I have a lot more coming in. Then I go to making salsa. So having canned tomatoes on hand, I can turn that into tomato paste or tomato sauce or pizza sauce, lasagna sauce, or salsa, or just about anything that I want. So by keeping it neutral and just canning whole tomatoes with just a little bit of the salt added, which helps preserve it and keep its color, I have a lot more options to using my tomatoes. So the tomatoes will go into the water bath for about 45 minutes at a slow, gentle boil for a pint. Now check the altitude in your area. It may be different. Alrighty, the tomatoes are in the canner. I may have confused y'all a little bit on the time. For us here in the South, it was 40 minutes for pints and 45 minutes for quarts. So you just want a really good, steady, low boil. Alright, it's Time to take the canned tomatoes out of the canner. Set them on top of a towel or something, and then you're going to want to cover them up to keep them out of any draft. I gently tilt it just a little bit. I don't think it's recommended that you just go crazy with it and swish it around. The water will absorb on top, don't worry, from the heat, and as it finishes processing, so don't waste too much time worried about that. So we did the 7 pints, which is the exact amount that we had enough for tomatoes for. We could have gotten a few more pints in the canner, but that's okay. Next time we'll do another batch of tomatoes. And that is all of our whole canned tomatoes. So I want to thank you all for joining me today. If you have any questions, just feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email. And that's going to be it for this video. I appreciate each and every one of you. Please be sure to leave a friendly comment, like, share, and subscribe. So farewell, Homestead family, friends, and neighbors from the Cozy Cottage Homestead.